My grandson hadn't spoken a single word in 6 years. Not a syllable, not a sound, not even a whisper in the dark when he thought no one was listening. That's what we believed. That's what the doctors told us. That's what his mother, my daughter-in-law Renata, made absolutely sure every single person in our lives understood. And then my son Trevor and his wife left for a 10-day trip to Sedona, Arizona. They backed out of the driveway at 7:14 in the morning. I watched the car turn the corner. I waved until I couldn't see them anymore. I turned around, took Marcus's small hand in mine, and started walking back toward the front porch. And that's when he stopped walking. He pulled gently on my hand. I looked down at him. He looked up at me with those enormous hazel eyes, and in a voice as clear and calm as a morning bell, he said, "Grandma Carol, don't eat the food she left you." I am 64 years old. I have survived a difficult marriage, the loss of my own mother, a cancer scare at 51, and more heartbreak than I care to count. Nothing in my life had prepared me for that moment. My name is Carol Whitfield. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, in the house I've owned for 31 years. It's a craftsman-style home with a big front porch and a garden that my late husband Raymond started the year we got married. After Raymond passed, that house became everything to me. The roots, the memories, the future I planned to leave behind for the people I loved. Trevor is my only child. He's 37 now, an operations manager for a logistics company. He's always been the kind of man who works hard and keeps his head down. And for most of his life, I was proud of that quality. He met Renata at a work conference 8 years ago. She was beautiful in that sharp, precise way, the kind of woman who always looked perfectly put together and always seemed to be doing calculations behind her eyes. I wanted to like her. I tried to like her. But there was always something. A coolness in the way she spoke to me. A flicker of impatience whenever I stayed too long at their house. A way she had of managing every room she walked into, including me. Marcus came along 5 years into their marriage. He was the most alert baby I had ever seen. From the very beginning, he tracked faces, responded to voices, reached for things with intention. When he was 14 months old, he said, "Bird," while pointing at a cardinal outside the window. I was in the room. I heard it with my own ears. 6 months later, Renata began telling doctors that Marcus wasn't speaking. By the time he was 2.5, she had appointments with 3 separate specialists. By 3, he had an official diagnosis of selective mutism with possible developmental delays. By 4, Renata had enrolled him in a special program on the other side of the city. A program that conveniently kept him away from most social situations where he might accidentally behave differently than she needed him to. I raised concerns once, only once. Trevor looked at me with those tired eyes and said, "Mom, please don't make this harder than it already is." So I stayed quiet, and I visited when I was allowed. And I loved Marcus as hard as I could across the distance Renata carefully maintained between us. Looking back now, I can see every piece of it. But when you love someone, when you trust your own child, you don't let yourself see what's right in front of you. You explain it away. You give people the benefit of the doubt. That is exactly what she counted on. The morning they left, Renata had spent almost 45 minutes in my kitchen. She organized the refrigerator herself, which I thought was unusually attentive. She labeled containers with blue masking tape and a marker. Carol's breakfast casserole, Carol's soup, heat on medium, Carol's evening snack, already portioned. She explained that she'd been worried about me lately, that I'd seemed tired on her last few visits, that she'd been reading about nutrition for women my age and had put together some things she thought would help. I was touched, genuinely touched. I remember thinking, Maybe I misjudged her. Maybe she's finally trying to be family. Grandma Carol, don't eat the food she left you. We were standing on the front porch. The September air was cool and clean. I could hear birds in the maple tree at the edge of the yard. And my supposedly nonverbal 6-year-old grandson was looking at me with complete, calm certainty. My first instinct was that I'd imagined it. My second instinct was that my knees might give out. I knelt down in front of him. I took both his hands in mine. I looked him in the face. And I said very gently, "Marcus, did you just talk to me?" He nodded once. Careful, deliberate. "Can you say something else?" I asked. He glanced over his shoulder at the empty road where their car had disappeared. Then looked back at me. "She checks the cameras sometimes," he said quietly. "We should go inside first." Cameras. I had a doorbell camera that Trevor had installed 2 years ago. He'd said it was for my safety. It connected to an app on his phone. And on Renata's phone. I took Marcus inside. I closed the front door. I moved us to the back of the house. To the small sunroom off the kitchen where I grew herbs in window boxes and kept a pair of old rocking chairs that had belonged to my mother. No cameras back there. No line of sight to the street. We sat down across from each other. And I waited. What Marcus told me over the next 2 hours changed everything I thought I knew about the past 3 years of my life. He spoke carefully, in the measured way of a child who had learned to think before every word. His vocabulary was extraordinary for his age. He'd been reading since he was 4, teaching himself from books Renata didn't know he could access. From captions on the television when she thought he was just staring blankly at the screen. He told me that Renata had come to him when he was 3 years old. Not long after the bird incident I'd witnessed. And explained with gentle, terrifying clarity what would happen if he ever spoke in front of the wrong people. He wouldn't get to see Grandma Carol anymore. He would have to go away to a special school very far from home. Daddy would be very sad and it would be Marcus's fault. 3 years old, she had sat down with a 3-year-old boy and systematically dismantled his confidence in his own voice. I had to breathe through that for a moment before I could keep listening. He told me about the food. Renata had started bringing prepared meals to my house roughly 18 months ago. Always under the banner of taking care of me. I'd started feeling tired and foggy around that same time. My doctor had mentioned that my bloodwork showed some irregularities, but attributed them to stress and aging. I'd had 2 minor falls in the past year that I couldn't fully explain. I'd started forgetting conversations, misplacing things in strange places, losing track of time in ways that frightened me. Trevor had begun gently bringing up the idea of assisted living. Renata had pulled him into those conversations with the kind of practiced concern that I now understood was anything but. "She puts powder in things," Marcus said quietly. "I watched her do it in the kitchen once. She didn't know I was looking. She had a little jar in her purse. And she mixed it into the soup she was making for you." A little jar. In her purse. He told me about a phone call he'd overheard 2 weeks earlier. Renata on the phone, standing in the hallway outside his bedroom door while he lay still and breathed slowly. The way he'd learned to breathe when he was pretending to be asleep. She'd said a name he didn't recognize. She'd talked about timing. She'd said the phrase, "before the end of the year," twice. And then she'd said, "Trevor doesn't need to know the details. He just needs to inherit the house and accept the money. I'll handle the rest." The house. My craftsman home in Asheville. Raymond's garden. 31 years of my life. assessed at $420,000 in the current market. Plus my savings, plus my life insurance policy, of which Trevor was the sole beneficiary. This was never about caregiving. It had never been about making sure I was comfortable or cared for as I got older. This was about making sure I got there faster. I excused myself and went to the kitchen. I stood at the refrigerator and looked at those carefully labeled containers with her precise handwriting. I'd been about to eat that breakfast casserole. I'd been planning to heat it up while Marcus had his morning cereal. I picked up every container. I put them all in a paper grocery bag. I put that bag in the trunk of my car. Evidence. Then I came back to the sunroom, sat down across from Marcus, and asked him what he needed from me. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "I need you to not pretend anymore. She always wins when everyone pretends." 8 words, from a 6-year-old. I'd spent 3 years pretending I wasn't frightened by my own memory lapses. Pretending Renata's concern was genuine. Pretending Trevor's passivity was just his way of managing stress. No more pretending. The first call I made was to my physician, Dr. Anita Bowers, who had treated me for 11 years. I told her I had reason to believe I'd been ingesting something that didn't belong in my food. I told her I needed a full blood panel as soon as possible. She got me in that same afternoon. The second call I made was to my attorney, James Whitmore. I told him I needed to review my will, my power of attorney, and any documents Trevor had access to. Immediately, he asked if everything was all right. I told him it would be. The third call I made was to my neighbor Donna, who lived 3 houses down and had known me for 20 years. I asked if Marcus and I could come for dinner that evening and maybe a sleepover for Marcus. I didn't explain why. Donna being Donna, she didn't ask. I was not going to spend the first night of this fight alone in my house with an unlocked app on someone else's phone watching my front door. While Marcus napped that afternoon, the deep, easy sleep of a child who had finally been allowed to exhale, I sat at my kitchen table and started writing down everything he had told me. Every detail, every date I could reconstruct, every observation about the labeled food and the powder in the jar and the phone call through the bedroom door. I wrote for 2 hours without stopping. By the time Marcus woke up, I had 14 pages. Dr. Bowers called me the following morning. Her voice was carefully controlled in the way medical professionals are trained to be when they have difficult information to deliver. "Carol," she said, "your panel shows elevated levels of diphenhydramine and something we're flagging as consistent with a sedative compound. Neither of those should be in your system based on your prescriptions. I need you to come in. And I need you to bring those food containers." I drove to her office with the paper bag from my trunk. She took the containers for testing. She referred me to a specialist for a more detailed neurological evaluation to assess what 18 months of low-level sedation might have done to my cognition. And then she asked me a question I'd been waiting for. "Carol, do you want me to contact the police? Or would you prefer to do that yourself?" "I'd like to do it myself," I said. "I need a few more days." Here's what I needed those days for. I needed Marcus to be safe before anything else happened. If I went to the police before Renata and Trevor returned and something went wrong, before the charges were solid enough to result in immediate action, Renata could come back to an open situation and Marcus would be in her custody. I called James Whitmore again. We talked for 90 minutes about emergency guardianship procedures, about what would need to happen and how fast it could happen once the police were involved. He began preparing paperwork. I also needed Trevor to make a choice. My son is not an evil man. I know that's complicated to say given everything. But I know my son. I know that Renata is the kind of person who finds the weakest point in people and applies exactly enough pressure to keep them compliant. Trevor's weak point was always the fear of conflict, of disruption, of having to confront something painful head-on. She had used that against him for years. I believed, and I still believe, that he did not fully understand what she was doing. He saw a wife who managed difficult situations. He saw a mother who seemed to struggle. He told himself the story she handed him and didn't look too closely at the pages underneath. But he was going to have to look now. Renata called on day 3 of their trip. Right on schedule. Marcus and I had discussed this. He had told me she usually called every 2 to 3 days to check on the food situation without appearing to check on the food situation. I answered on the second ring. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Warm, solicitous, perfectly pitched." "A little foggy," I said, making my voice sound slower than usual. "I've been sleeping a lot more than normal. I tried to eat the soup last night but I got confused about the stove and just went to bed." There was a pause, brief, but it was there. "Oh, Carol," she said, and the satisfaction beneath the concern was almost audible to me now that I knew what I was listening for. "That's the fatigue catching up with you. Just rest, don't push yourself, the food will keep." "You're always so thoughtful," I said. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Another pause. Then, smoothly, "That's what family is for." When she asked about Marcus, her voice shifted into something more careful. She wanted to know if he'd been difficult, if he'd acted out, if he'd done anything unusual. "He's been very quiet," I said truthfully. "Just watches me and plays. You'd barely know he was here." "Perfect," she said, with a warmth that didn't belong anywhere near that word. After I hung up, I sat for a long moment in the sunroom with my hands in my lap. Then I picked up my phone and called the Asheville Police Department's non-emergency line. I asked to be connected to a detective. I explained that I had evidence of what I believed was ongoing poisoning by a family member, and that I had a child who had been the victim of prolonged psychological abuse and suppression. I gave them everything: the food containers, the blood test results, the 14 pages of notes, Dr. Bowers's contact information, James Whitmore's contact information, the doorbell camera app login information so they could see when it had been accessed and by whom. 2 detectives came to my home that afternoon. Detective Sandra Okafor was the one who spent the most time with Marcus. She was patient and careful and clearly experienced with children. She sat with him in the sunroom for almost an hour while her partner talked with me in the living room. When she came out, her expression was controlled, but I could see something moving behind it. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "your grandson is one of the most remarkable children I have ever interviewed." Trevor and Renata came back to Asheville on a Sunday afternoon, 5 days after they'd left. They did not come back to my house. They came back to a warrant. The food containers had tested positive for crushed prescription sleep medication and a sedative compound used primarily in veterinary contexts, which suggested a secondary source that investigators traced to an online supplier Renata had been using under a variant of her maiden name. Her search history, accessed via the warrant, included queries about cognitive decline symptoms in women in their 60s, natural-appearing causes of death in elderly patients, and North Carolina inheritance law. Marcus's statement, recorded carefully by Detective Okafor, provided the investigative framework that the physical evidence confirmed. Renata was arrested at the Asheville Regional Airport before she reached the baggage claim. Trevor was detained for questioning. I was at Donna's house with Marcus when my phone rang and Detective Okafor told me it was done. I excused myself and went out onto Donna's back porch. It was a cool Sunday evening. The sky was going orange and pink over the mountain ridge to the west. I stood there for a long time without moving. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about this kind of situation is ever simple. Trevor was not charged. The investigation found no evidence that he had direct knowledge of the nature of what Renata had been doing. He knew she managed my food and expressed concerns about my health. He'd participated, passively, in conversations about assisted living. But there was nothing to indicate he understood what was actually in my food. What the investigation did reveal was that Renata had been conducting this plan entirely on her own, with the calculated patience of someone who had planned to never get caught. She had been wrong about that. The charges against Renata included felony poisoning, criminal endangerment of an elderly person, and felony child abuse related to the years of psychological coercion she had used to force Marcus into silence. Her attorney argued that the child abuse charge was unprecedented and difficult to prove. The jury disagreed. She was sentenced to 19 years. Trevor asked to see me 2 weeks after Renata's arrest. He came to my house alone, stood on my front porch, and couldn't quite meet my eyes. I let him in. I made coffee. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd written those 14 pages of notes. And we talked for 3 hours. It was the most honest conversation Trevor and I had ever had in our lives. He wept when I told him about the powder in my soup. He wept harder when I described the afternoon 3-year-old Marcus had been told in careful, gentle language that his voice could destroy everything he loved. I didn't know, he kept saying. Mom, I swear to you, I didn't know. I believe you, I told him, and I did. What I also told him was that not knowing was not the same as being blameless. That the passivity he'd been so comfortable with had created the space where this could grow. That his son had spent 3 years protecting both of us from the inside of a silence no child should ever have to live in. I have to earn this back, he said quietly. Yes, I agreed, you do. Marcus came to live with me permanently 8 months ago. It was Trevor's decision, supported by the family court and by the child psychologist who had been working with Marcus since the investigation began. He started first grade this September at a small school 15 minutes from my house. His teacher called me during the second week to tell me that Marcus had raised his hand during circle time and answered 3 questions in a row, and that the other children had started asking him to sit next to them at lunch. I had to pull over on the way home from the grocery store to let myself cry for a few minutes before I could drive again. This morning, Marcus and I planted the last of the fall bulbs in Raymond's garden. Tulips and daffodils, the kind that come up every spring whether you're thinking about them or not. Just quietly keeping the promise you made in autumn. Marcus patted the soil down carefully over each bulb with both hands, the way I'd shown him. Will they really come back every year? He asked. Every year, I told him. They don't forget. He thought about that for a moment. Then he looked up at me with those hazel eyes and said, kind of like us. Kind of like us. I've thought a lot about what I would tell someone who's sitting where I was sitting 18 months ago, foggy and tired. Attributing it to age, choosing to see the kindness in someone's gestures instead of what those gestures were actually doing. Here's what I'd say. Trust the children in your life more than you think you need to. They watch everything. They understand more than we let ourselves believe. And when they find a moment safe enough to speak, listen like it's the most important thing you'll ever hear. It might be. And pay attention to the silence. Sometimes silence is peace, and sometimes silence is a small, Brave person waiting for the exact right moment to save your life. Now, I'm curious about you. If you'd been in my place that September morning, what would you have done? Have you ever had a moment where a child showed you something the adults around you were hiding? Tell me in the comments, and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story traveled. Thank you for staying with me until the end.